So there seem to be a lot of rumors floating around that we may see the declaration of a national emergency at some point, we'll say this year, probably sooner rather than later. That is unconfirmed, right? And we don't know. We won't know until it happens or does not happen. But I did want to dig into a little bit is what's that mean? What's a national emergency declaration mean? So I dug around a little bit. There's the National Emergencies Act. It says the National Emergencies Act authorizes the president to declare a national emergency without a specific request from a state. Such declarations do not provide any specific emergency authority and instead rely on emergency authorities provided in other statutes. Emergency statute provisions are not activated automatically. The president must specify which authorities are activated in the specific emergency declaration. So in and of itself, it's very vague, right? Super vague on what the National Emergency Act is and what that means. What it means if he triggers it, you go up and say, hey, national emergency, guys, right? So I had to dig a little bit more. So there's information on federal emergency declarations and authorities. So it says, as with the states, federal law imbues designated federal officials with broad powers that allow them to respond to and assist states and localities in responding to emergencies, even without a federal emergency declaration. Of course, we're talking about a federal emergency declaration. Thus, the Secretary of Health and Human Services has broad authority under Section 301 and 311 of the Public Health Service Act to provide assistance to states and localities. Federal law also provides the president and other federal officials with authority to declare emergencies under specific conditions. So you have the Stanford Act and the National Emergencies Act. I just read you the National Emergencies Act. Once again, very vague. But what happens? What happens? It's a domino, right? You push the domino, emergencies declared. So there are a few things. Federal emergency declarations activate legal and programmatic responses from federal agencies, including activating federal assistance to states in the form of financial, personnel services, logistics, and technical assistance, triggering emergency provisions in other laws, including Social Security Act, Section 1135, waivers and statutory immunities and liability protections such as the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, which is the PERP Act, and I'll actually get into that. That's an interesting one. Easing regulatory requirements on individuals, organizations, state and local governments, as well as activating the National Response Framework, National Incident Management System, and other emergency response protocols and systems, right? So we'll get into those three items. A couple other areas I want to dig into. It took a little digging, right? All this is very vague. You trigger this, it triggers that, and this triggers that, and that triggers that is sort of what we're seeing. A lot of triggers. Once again, no guarantee this is going to happen, but there seem to be a lot of people talking about. So I want to dig in and understand, like, what does it even mean, right? What does it even mean if something like this happens? So implications of state and federal emergency declarations and authorities. An emergency declaration can change legal and operational landscape in which governments, private organizations, and the public operate during an emergency. Emergency declarations, especially if they occur at multiple levels, federal, state, and local, can confuse organizations and individuals. I know we're already all confused here. All state agencies need to understand the implications of operating under an emergency declaration, especially those that are not directly involved in response activities such as state procurement offices. States must also understand the legal and operational effects of federal emergency declaration. Federal declarations may affect compliance with federal legal and programmatic requirements. So I'm going to kind of stop there on that one. This is out of ASTHO.org, Emergency Authority and Immunity Toolkit. And immunity is actually part of it. So we talked about the PERP Act, so the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, passed by the United States Congress, signed into law by President of the United States George Bush. is essentially, it's a controversial tort liability shield intended to protect pharmaceutical manufacturers from financial risk in the event of a declared public health emergency. Declared emergency, it provides legal protections from the manufacturers of things like vaccines, right? So that's an automatic, the moment you declare the emergency, that automatically kicks in. There's also the National Response Framework, as well as the National Incident Management System, and I looked at both of those, and essentially it's a centralization of emergency response, centralization of emergency management at the federal level, pushing things more into the feds, where the states can certainly declare their own emergencies, but it's a centralization. It's pulling everything back essentially to the federal government. Once again, had to dig more, right? None of that is entirely obvious in its implications, and some of the stuff really ties back to what we already saw in the last pandemic all those years ago, and certainly have to be careful on anything said, as I don't want to trigger censorship, right? Don't want to lead astray of the thought police. But one thing I did find in digging through is lockdowns and National Guard, right? The use of National Guard, law enforcement, and other measures necessary to protect public health and safety, and that's FEMA 2020. So that is certainly on the list. Now, we have talked about things like martial law before. Martial law has been declared in the United States 68 times in the United States, but if there is this national declaration of an emergency that triggers all these broad powers that can include certain centralizations of activities, reporting, budgeting, as well as legal protections for responders, for pharmaceutical companies. So why might we see something like this? And I'm only theorizing, as I don't know, right? I said that a lot of people speculating at the possibility of something like this happening in the near future, and have been speculating, like almost anticipating, right? We're sort of sitting around waiting, like, why hasn't something been declared yet? And not necessarily for good reason, depending on who you talk to, right? There is the bird flu, right? The big bird flu is spreading through cattle. It doesn't seem like human-to-human transmission. That may or may not stop a declaration of an emergency, but we also see the potential for a declaration of an emergency historically for things like civil unrest, and we certainly have plenty of that now, right? You see all the protests and whatnot. And I think we all anticipate more civil unrest as the year unfolds. It is civil unrest season, right? And not necessarily offering any explanation as why we live in a world where civil unrest seems common. There's just a lot going on, and it seems to be upsetting a lot of people, right? But the potential for lockdowns is still there. The potential for martial law is still there, though you wouldn't necessarily even have to declare a emergency in order to declare martial law. We've talked about martial law before. Its door's pretty wide open in terms of, hey, I'm going to declare martial law. Certainly you want to have a palatable justification, and perhaps national emergency would give that justification, but historically it's pretty loose on when or why something like that might be declared. If there is martial law, we've talked about that. If there are lockdowns, we've all been through lockdowns before. Comply or not, I'm not offering advice either way, but you might want to think about how you would prepare for potential civil unrest, potential lockdowns, potential martial law, and it comes back down to your basic preps, right, and things we talk about on this channel. How independent are you from having to go to the grocery store every week? Do you have extra food? Do you have extra water? What if there was a grid down? What if there was power outage? Do you have options? Getting attacked by a bug here. I think it's got me. I think the bug's going to get me. Do you have options Do you have reserves, right? Do you have a little water stashed away? Do you have a little bit of food stashed away? Do you have first aid supplies stashed away? We talked about being your own first responder. Anything like that could happen. I don't know that you need a lifetime supply of toilet paper stashed away. That seemed to be the general response last time, and I think part of that had to do with panic, right? A lot of people aren't prepared. They're not interested in preparedness. They're not watching the YouTube preppers, right, giving out all the great advice. So when something happens, they just go into panic mode, right? I don't know what to do. My neighbor said get all the toilet paper I could afford, so that's what I did. So I must be okay now. You know, you see it whenever there's a big storm. Everyone runs to the store. They buy their milk and bread in great quantities, so they're prepared for that one-day storm. All perishable, of course. So trying to be prepared, trying to get ahead of it, reduces panic if something like this happens. Once again, I can't speculate on the likelihood of a national emergency, of a lockdown, of another pandemic, right? It's sort of wait and see. No one calls me up and tells me that kind of stuff ahead of time. I have no secret contacts there, but I can look at what's going on. You look at what people are predicting, what they're talking about, and the idea of being prepared at some level right now is not a bad idea. Not bad to think about. So when something does happen, you're not panicking, run to the store and buy toilet paper, milk, and bread, right? Have some food stashed away, have some extra water stashed away. Think about medical supplies, think about first aid, and certainly self-defense. We always talk about self-defense. You may find yourself in a situation where you have to defend yourself, and if you do have to defend yourself, think about being prepared for that kind of situation, right? You trained, do you understand the laws? Some very basic things come into play there that you want to sort out ahead of time on all of that. So I hope that helps out. Thank you for watching, and we appreciate you.